Hi, Michael Yardney here, and in this week's Property Insider video, I'm going to have a chat with Andrew Wilson about some proposed new tax reforms that will affect you if you're interested in property, and not affect you in the best way, to be blunt. And we're also going to give you Dr. Andrew Wilson's latest updates on what's happening in real time in the property markets. So if you're interested in property, click the subscribe button below so that you keep getting our weekly videos, and click the little bell symbol so that you can be notified when they... The economic recovery from coronavirus is sure to be long and painful. New forecasts are predicting the coronavirus crisis is going to punch a $360 billion hole in the federal budget. But while most economists argue the government shouldn't be in too much of a rush to repair the budget, they are suggesting that tax reform is urgently needed to assist the recovery. Recently, Deloitte Access Economics predicted the economy is going to be suffering a hangover for quite a number of years to come. And of course, it's not only a problem for the federal government, our state government budgets are also being hard hit. Most experts agree that the economic recovery is going to require some form of tax reform. But they're coming up with some unusual, interesting ideas, including abolishing stamp duty, raising GST. So to discuss some of these proposals and what it could mean to you, I'm looking forward to my weekly chat with Australia's leading housing economist, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market. Welcome, Andrew.
G'day, Michael.
Well, Andrew, according to the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe, in his mind, the best way for the nation to recover from this once-in-a-century economic crisis is for governments to underwrite a business-led recovery. But he's also suggesting we're embracing the Henry tax review and adopting what he called overdue tax reforms. And the words he used were taxing income generation, consumption and land. Now, if I read between the lines, to me, that's a secret code for cutting business taxes, increasing the GST, but also abandoning state-based property stamp duties in favour of land tax. I've heard a few pundits even mention, hey, let's remove negative gearing. It's come up again, Andrew. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's disgraceful, Michael, that we should be using what's going to be the most significant economic shock in most of our lifetimes as cover to remix our taxes. And of course, property is the favourite target, ideological claptrap. And I just think that we've got to work as hard as we can to get consumers back in action. This is going to be a significantly battered and bruised economy for quite some time. And I don't think it's the environment where we should be fiddling with the tax mix. And I just think it's reasonably disgraceful that, we're getting these propositions again in regard to changing tax mix, specifically in property, when our real issue is going to be millions of Australians either without work or being underpaid or underemployed into the foreseeable future. We need to look at increasing demand in the short term, not shifting demand with different tax policies for some perceived medium to longer term advantage. This is all about, at the end of the day, in my opinion, broadening the tax base. And this has been a hobby horse, of course, for governments, big surprise, but not that popular with the electorate for a number of years.
Well, let's be clear, there's only one reason behind it. It is to increase the tax base. It's not to actually give us money back. So the state governments have, during the booming property years, benefited from substantial stamp duty, but they're missing out on that at the moment, aren't they, Andrew?
Well, they are. And this is why state governments love the rivers of gold during boom times in the housing market. But of course, when we get corrections in our housing market, those rivers of gold turn to rivers of mud. And that means there's not that certainty in terms of budgeting for state governments. That's their main income source. Of course, stamp duty, other than the GST, but they obviously want to transfer that stamp duty environment into something more reliable, and that means broadening the base and taking away their exposure to the cycles of the housing market.
So in other words, rather than a discretionary tax where I understand if I'm going to buy a house, if I'm going to upgrade my home, if I'm going to move to a better suburb, it's a cost of living. Everyone, you, me, anyone who owns a home or an investment property, well, it depends what the thresholds are. They're not going to change the tax rules to lower land tax in general. They've got to make up for the lost stamp duty. So we're all going to pay a bit extra, Andrew.
Well, that's the point, and it becomes a can of worms. Where do you pitch the entry level, even if you have some exemptions? Who's exempt? And as you said, Michael, stamp duty is a discretionary tax. If you're not buying property, you don't pay stamp duty. what that would shift to with land tax is that everybody pays it above a certain level. And the other point is that if we took away stamp duty, what you would do would be, in the short term at least, activate more buyers, because that stamp duty could be used as a deposit, and that would of course increase prices in the short term in a normal market environment. At the end of the day, regardless of the merits, stamp duty versus land tax, in my opinion, that particular proposition replacing stamp duty with land tax has more holes than Swiss cheese, but we're not here really to advocate that, because there are no policies out there, and it will be a real hot potato in the political environment. Believe me, Michael, it'll take a very courageous state government to do that. The main game now, Michael, is recovering. We haven't had the real hit yet from the coronavirus shutdown. The real pain is to come. We need to be focusing on getting people back to work, getting those incomes up again, rather than talking about the ideological claptrap that comes out in regard to changing the tax mix.
Well, let's finish off that topic with one thought that, in my mind, land tax is really a wealth tax. Those who own land are going to have to pay more tax. Like way back in the old days, there used to be a window tax in countries where the more windows your property had, the more tax you paid. But Andrew, people got around it by shuttering up their windows and pretending they didn't have windows. And if they come up with this new tax, I bet there's ways people are going to get around that too. They'll buy their investment properties in other states or do things to see how they can skirt it.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And if there was any wisdom in our policymakers, they'd use the property market to unleash the real rivers of gold, which is the pent-up demand for property that Australia typically has, and which other governments have used in periods of similar economic downturns to fertilise and revitalise our economy. So look to the property market, guys. That's your best bet in terms of getting activity underway. There's been too much fiddling with the property market through our policymakers, and they've burnt their fingers over recent years doing this. Let's get onto the positive side of the equation and take advantage of Australia's very robust and resilient housing market in these deeply concerning times.
Well, let's turn to what's happening in the housing market now. You've got a number of indices that are giving us a more real-time understanding of what's going on. So let's start with your National New Listing Index.
This is a measure on a day-to-day basis of the number of new listings coming into the market for the past week. We saw obviously a decline as the coronavirus started to impact seller sentiment, no surprise. We then saw a sharp dip over the Easter period. We've seen a recovery since then, but we've seen a dipping away from that recovery and a falling away over the last week. But the latest data shows that again has picked up. But nonetheless, despite those variations over the past week, Michael, we're around about 16% lower than where we were at the same time last year in terms of new listings coming into the market. But we've got to understand, Michael, that a year ago we were in the middle of the federal election campaign. It was also a quiet period in the cycle, if you remember, a year ago, Michael, so sellers were thin on the ground. And I think that sort of works towards that overall 34 to 40% lower in terms of the number of new listings coming into the market. But at the moment, I think the market's still working on the fact that we haven't had any significant negative measures, and I think sentiment's still holding up just at the moment, Michael, but the real challenges are to come.
Well, let's break it down state by state. How's it working around Australia?
Well, look, that's quite interesting, Michael, because when we look at the state-by-state breakdown, we can see that it's really Melbourne and Brisbane that have been the underperformers over the last week in terms of new listings.
So now we're looking at this relativity index with Sydney being the base. What are you showing there?
Again, Michael, that gives us an indication of the relative position in terms of those new listing numbers. And it shows that's getting closer now, that Melbourne and Sydney are almost identical in terms of the proportion or the number of new listings coming into the market.
Let's just have a look and see how it translated into sales over the last little while. What's happened in the Melbourne market in home sales?
So we've got new sales data, and this is new sales coming through as an index. So this is tracking new sales as they come through. And we can see that the Melbourne market has remained reasonably steady over the past week. And if we look at the breakdown in terms of those new sales auctions versus private sales, we can see clearly, and no surprise, that it's the weakness of auction sales, and particularly in Melbourne, which has a high proportion of auction activity compared to any of the other capital cities, that's really keeping that new sales volumes down. but when we look at Sydney, it's at a higher level. So I think the lesson from that, Michael, is that private sales are holding up in Sydney. They're not really picking up in terms of lack of auction sales in Melbourne, which you would have expected perhaps the transference from auction to private treaty. Looks to be happening in Sydney, but not as strongly in Melbourne, where it's actually needed because Melbourne has that higher proportion of auction activity. So it's a good storyline for Sydney this week, Michael. Higher numbers of listings, sales are growing, particularly private sales. Of course, auction sales are still very low.
It's something we'll keep a track of week by week because they've opened up the ability to have outdoor auctions in Sydney and now in Melbourne with up to 10 people at auctions. There's still going to be restrictions. There's still going to be people nervous about having lots of visitors through their homes. So I don't think the auction market's going to rebound as quickly as some of the people in the industry would like it to, Andrew.
Absolutely, Michael. That's going to be a long journey, and we've got a lot of probably ugly headlines heading our way in terms of what's to happen in the economy. That's not going to do a lot for confidence.
So house price turnover has dropped considerably. We're probably buying and selling as many properties in a month as we used to in a week a year or so ago. But rentals have actually suffered more than house prices recently, Andrew.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. As we spoke last week in our monthly wrap, we have record levels of properties listed for rent in Melbourne and Sydney. When we look at the data, it's listings for units that are really surging at the moment.
And in general, they tend to be those apartments closer to the CBD, close to the universities, those that come on from Airbnb or short-term letting or student letting. So there is, as you said a moment ago, going to be some more bad news moving forward, some difficult headlines with unemployment figures, with economic figures. But as we keep saying, this is a short-term thing and we've got to keep a long-term focus. Let's not get too scared, and that's why each week we're going to keep an update on what's happening in real time. Thanks for your time today, Andrew.
Thank you, Michael.